The dust devil spinning across the Wyoming plain carried the scent of rain that would never come, and Owen Rutherford watched it from his porch with the kind of emptiness that settles into a man's bones when he realizes he's been talking to his horse more than to people for the better part of 3 years. His ranch stretched out before him, 200 acres of stubborn grassland that fought against the drought of 1878 with about as much success as he'd had fighting his own loneliness. The cattle he'd managed to keep alive were scattered across the eastern pasture, and the barn needed repairs he kept putting off because what was the point of fixing anything when there was nobody to share it with? His wife had died in childbirth 4 years ago, taking their daughter with her, and Owen had buried his heart alongside them in the small cemetery outside Chloride. He was 32 years old and felt twice that age most mornings. The sun was climbing toward noon when he noticed the figure at his gate, nearly a quarter-mile down the dirt road that connected his property to what passed for civilization in this corner of Wyoming territory. At first he thought it might be a mirage, the kind of trick the heat played on a man's eyes when the summer stretched on too long. But the figure remained solid, standing there with what looked like a traveling bag at her feet. Owen squinted against the glare and reached for the rifle he kept by the door, not out of hostility but out of habit. You didn't survive long in Wyoming without a healthy respect for the unexpected. He walked down from the porch, his boots kicking up small clouds with each step, and made his way toward the gate. As he got closer, he could make out more details. The figure was definitely a woman, probably in her mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and a dress that had seen better days but was clean and well-mended. She stood with her chin up, shoulders back, like someone who'd made a decision and intended to see it through. When Owen was close enough to speak without shouting, he stopped about 10 feet away and rested the rifle against his shoulder in a way that was casual but ready. "Can I help you, miss?" The woman met his eyes directly, and Owen felt something shift in his chest, like a door he'd nailed shut suddenly remembering it had hinges. Her eyes were green, the color of new leaves in spring, and they held a mixture of determination and something else he couldn't quite place. Desperation, maybe, or hope that had been beaten down but refused to die. "I heard you needed help," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the obvious dust of travel on her clothes and skin. Owen blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "I heard in town that you were looking for help with the ranch, that you'd lost your foreman and couldn't manage on your own." She gestured at the land behind him. "I'm not proud and I need work. I'm a hard worker and I learn fast. Who told you I was looking for help?" Owen asked, genuinely bewildered. He hadn't told anyone in Chloride anything of the sort, though it was true enough that he was drowning in work he couldn't keep up with alone. The woman's confidence flickered for just a moment. "The woman at the general store, Mrs. Patterson. She said you'd been coming in less and less, that your supplies were running low, and that she figured you must be having trouble keeping up with the ranch work." Owen almost laughed. Martha Patterson had been trying to manage his life since his wife died, always suggesting he hire help or take on a partner, or, most frequently, that he consider courting again. He'd ignored all of it with the single-minded stubbornness that had become his defining characteristic. But apparently Martha had decided to take matters into her own hands. "Mrs. Patterson talks too much," he said, but there was no real heat in it. "Maybe," the woman agreed. "But is she wrong?" Owen looked at her properly then, really looked. She was travel-worn and dusty, but there was steel in her spine and capability in the way she held herself. Her hands, when she gestured, showed calluses that spoke of hard work, not the soft hands of someone who'd lived an easy life. He found himself curious despite his better judgment. "What's your name?" he asked. Adelaide Reeves, she said. I go by Ada. Well, Miss Reeves, I appreciate you coming all the way out here, but I can't hire you. Something flashed across her face, quick as lightning. Why not? Because I'm a woman. Partly, Owen admitted, because he'd always believed in honesty even when it wasn't comfortable. But mostly because I can't afford to pay anyone. The ranch is barely breaking even, and I've got enough saved to see me through the next few months if I'm careful. There's no money for wages. Ada's shoulders slumped slightly, and Owen felt like he'd kicked a puppy. But then she straightened again, that determination hardening into something almost fierce. What if I worked for room and board? Just until I can save enough to move on. I've been on the road for 2 weeks, Mr. Rutherford, and I'm down to my last dollar. I can work hard. I know cattle, I can mend fences, I can handle a horse, and I can cook better than whatever you've been eating based on how thin you look. Owen bristled at that. How do you know my name? Mrs. Patterson told me that too. Of course she had. Owen rubbed his hand over his face, feeling the several days' worth of stubble there, and tried to think of all the reasons this was a terrible idea. A single man and a single woman living on the same property would cause talk in town, the kind of talk that could damage both their reputations. He didn't know anything about her beyond what she'd told him, and Wyoming was full of people running from something. And perhaps most importantly, he'd grown comfortable in his isolation, in his grief, and having someone else around would disturb that in ways he wasn't sure he was ready for. But when he looked at Ada Reeves standing there in the dusty road, her green eyes fixed on him with a mixture of pride and barely concealed need, he found himself remembering what it was like to care about something beyond just surviving another day. You really know how to work cattle? He asked. Hope flickered across her face. My father had a ranch in Colorado. I grew up working it alongside my brothers. What happened? The hope dimmed. He died. Fever took him and my mother both, winter before last. My brothers sold the ranch and headed to California. They wanted me to marry a friend of theirs, a man twice my age who already had 3 wives in the grave. I decided I'd rather make my own way. Owen understood that kind of loss, that kind of determination to keep moving because stopping meant drowning. He sighed, already knowing he was going to regret this but unable to stop himself. There's a small cabin about 100 yards from the main house. My foreman used to live there before he headed back east. It's not much, but it's got a roof and a stove. You can stay there, and I'll feed you 3 meals a day in exchange for help around the ranch. We'll try it for a month and see how it goes. The smile that broke across Ada's face was like sunrise after a long night, and Owen felt his chest tighten in a way that was both painful and somehow right. Thank you, she said, and there was genuine emotion in her voice. You won't regret this, Mr. Rutherford, I promise. Call me Owen, he said, opening the gate. And I'm already regretting it, but that doesn't seem to be stopping me. Ada picked up her traveling bag, and Owen noticed it wasn't very heavy. Whatever possessions she had in the world, they fit in that one small bag. The realization made something protective stir in him, an instinct he'd thought died with his wife. They walked back toward the main house in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Owen found himself sneaking glances at her, noting the way she took in the ranch with an assessing eye, the way she walked with purpose despite obvious exhaustion. When they passed the corral, his horse, a big bay gelding named Prophet, came to the fence and nickered. Ada stopped and went to him without hesitation, holding out her hand for the horse to sniff. Prophet, who'd been Owen's only real companion for years, immediately pushed his nose into her palm, and Owen felt an irrational stab of jealousy. He's beautiful, Ada said, stroking Prophet's neck with the easy confidence of someone who genuinely understood horses. What's his name, Prophet? That's unusual. My wife named him. She said he had wise eyes and would always lead us in the right direction. Owen wasn't sure why he'd offered that information. He rarely talked about Sarah anymore. Ada looked at him with those green eyes, and there was understanding there, sympathy without pity. She sounds like she was special. She was. They continued to the cabin, which Owen hadn't been inside in months. When he opened the door, dust motes danced in the light streaming through the small window, and he was immediately embarrassed by the state of it. There was dirt on every surface, cobwebs in the corners, and a general air of abandonment. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have kept it up. I'll help you clean it out." "It's fine," Ada said, setting down her bag and rolling up her sleeves. "I've started with worse. If you've got a broom and some rags, I can have it livable by tonight." Owen wanted to insist on helping, but the determined set of her jaw told him she needed to do this herself, to prove she was capable and worth the chance he was giving her. So he nodded and went to fetch cleaning supplies from the main house, along with fresh linens for the bed and a few other basics she'd need. When he returned, Ada had already swept out the worst of the dust and was examining the small stove in the corner. "Does this work?" "It should. Might need some cleaning, but the flue was clear last I checked. Then I can make my own breakfast and supper," she said. "You mentioned 3 meals. Should I come to the main house for those? For now, until you're settled, we'll work out a routine." Owen set down the supplies and hesitated. "There's a well between here and the main house. Water's good. And the outhouse is about 50 feet that way," he pointed. "If you need anything else, just knock on the door." Ada turned to face him fully, wiping a strand of hair from her face and leaving a streak of dirt across her cheek. "Owen, I want you to know I understand what a risk this is for you. A strange woman showing up at your gate asking for help. I'll work hard, and I'll respect your privacy and your property. You have my word." The sincerity in her voice did something to Owen's carefully constructed walls, made them feel less necessary somehow. "I believe you," he said, and realized he meant it. "Get yourself settled and then come up to the house. We'll have some lunch and I'll show you around the ranch properly." He left before she could respond, walking back to the main house with his mind churning. What had he just done? Martha Patterson was going to have a field day with this when word got out. The whole town would be talking about Owen Rutherford and the mysterious woman living in his foreman's cabin. But as he climbed the steps to his porch and looked back to see smoke starting to rise from the cabin's chimney, he realized he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Less alone. An hour later, Ada knocked on his door. She'd cleaned up as best she could with limited water, and her hair was now loose around her shoulders, dark and wavy and catching the afternoon light. Owen's mouth went dry, and he had to remind himself that this was a business arrangement, nothing more. "Come in," he said. "I made sandwiches. It's not fancy, but it'll keep you going." The inside of Owen's house told its own story. It was clean enough but sparse, lacking any of the small touches that made a house a home. There were no curtains on the windows, no pictures on the walls, no flowers on the table. It was a place where someone existed but didn't really live. Ada didn't comment on any of it. She simply sat at the table when Owen gestured to a chair and accepted the plate he offered with thanks. They ate in a silence that was only slightly awkward, both of them aware of the strangeness of the situation but willing to push through it. "Tell me about the ranch," Ada said finally. "How many head of cattle? What's the grazing situation? What needs to be done most urgently?" Owen appreciated her directness. "I've got about 50 head left. Had twice that 2 years ago, but the drought's been hard, and I've had to sell off more than I wanted to keep the rest alive. There's a creek that runs through the eastern section that still has some water, so that's where I'm keeping most of them now. The big problem is the fencing. I've got sections that need mending in at least 6 places that I know of, probably more that I haven't found yet. Without good fencing, I'm losing cattle to drift and can't control the grazing patterns. What about hay for winter? That's the other problem. I need to cut and store hay, but I can't do that and keep up with the fencing and the regular daily work. I've been trying to do everything at once and not doing any of it well enough. Ada nodded, her expression thoughtful. So we prioritize. Fencing first, because without that nothing else matters. Then we work on the hay. If we can get those 2 things done before winter, you'll be in a much better position. She'd said we like it was the most natural thing in the world, like they were partners in this rather than a desperate woman and a lonely man who'd made an impulsive decision. Owen found he didn't mind the presumption. "All right," he said. "We'll start on the eastern fence line tomorrow. It's the worst section and it's where I need the strongest boundaries." They finished lunch, and Owen showed Ada around the ranch properly, pointing out the various pastures, the barn that needed repairs, the chicken coop that hadn't housed chickens in 2 years, and the boundaries of his property. Ada listened intently, asking intelligent questions and occasionally offering suggestions that showed she genuinely did know ranch work. As the afternoon wore on, Owen found himself relaxing in her presence. Ada had a straightforward way about her that he appreciated. She didn't try to fill silences with meaningless chatter, but when she spoke, it was worth listening to. And there was something about the way she looked at his struggling ranch, not with pity, but with a kind of determined optimism, that made him think maybe things didn't have to be as bleak as they'd felt. That night, after Ada had returned to her cabin and Owen was alone in his house again, he sat on his porch and watched the stars emerge. The ranch felt different somehow, charged with a possibility he hadn't felt in years. He thought about Sarah, about the guilt he'd carried since her death, the sense that he'd failed her by not being able to save her. But tonight, for the first time, that guilt felt a little less crushing. Maybe Martha Patterson had been right to meddle. Maybe it was time to let someone else in, even just a little bit. The next morning, Owen woke before dawn out of habit and was surprised to see smoke already rising from Ada's cabin. When he walked over, he found her dressed in men's work clothes, her hair braided tightly, and looking ready for whatever the day would bring. "Good morning," she said brightly. "I hope you don't mind. I found these clothes in a trunk in the cabin. I figured they'd work better for ranch work than a dress." The clothes had belonged to his former foreman, Tom, and seeing them on Ada's much smaller frame would have been comical if there hadn't been something rather endearing about the way she'd cinched the pants with rope and rolled up the sleeves of the shirt. "That's fine. Practical. I thought so. What time do you want to head out?" "After breakfast. Come up to the house in about 20 minutes. Owen made a simple meal of eggs, bacon, and coffee, and when Ada arrived, she ate with the appetite of someone who'd gone hungry more recently than she'd probably admit. He didn't comment on it, just made sure her plate was full. They loaded supplies onto a wagon, fence posts and wire and tools, and headed out to the eastern section of the ranch with Prophet tied to the back. The sun was just fully up when they reached the damaged fence, and Owen had to admit the situation was worse than he'd remembered. A whole section, maybe 50 yards, was either down completely or so damaged it was useless. "Well," Ada said, surveying the work ahead. "Good thing we started with this one. At least nothing else will look as bad." They worked through the morning, falling into a rhythm that surprised Owen with its ease. Ada knew what she was doing, handling the post digger with competence and stringing wire with the kind of tight, even tension that spoke of experience. They didn't talk much while they worked, both of them focused on the task, but the silence was comfortable. Around midday, They took a break in the shade of a cottonwood tree near the creek. Owen had brought water and some bread and cheese, and they sat on the bank watching the sluggish flow of water that was all the drought had left of what used to be a proper stream. "It's beautiful here," Ada said quietly. "Even with the drought, you can tell this land has good bones." Owen looked at her curiously. "Good bones. My father used to say it. Some land is just tired, worn out from poor management or bad luck. But other land, it's just waiting for the right conditions to flourish again. This land has good bones. When the rains come back, and they will eventually, this ranch will thrive. You sound very certain about that." Ada smiled, and Owen felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. "I have to be certain about something. Might as well be the land." They worked until the sun started to sink toward the horizon, and by the time they headed back, they'd completed about half the damaged section. Owen's muscles ached in a way that felt good, like he'd accomplished something real, and he realized it was the first day in a long time he hadn't spent at least part of dwelling on his grief. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a routine. They'd start early, work through the day on whatever project was most urgent, and then Ada would return to her cabin while Owen retreated to his house. But the boundaries between them started to blur in small ways. Ada began taking her meals at the main house rather than making her own, partly because it was more efficient and partly because neither of them wanted to admit how much they'd come to enjoy the company. They'd eat breakfast while planning the day's work, have a quick lunch in whatever field they were working, and then linger over dinner, talking about the ranch but also, gradually, about other things. Owen learned that Ada had grown up as the youngest child and only daughter in a family of 5 children, that she'd learned to ride before she could properly walk, and that her father had taught her everything he taught her brothers, because he believed capability mattered more than gender. She'd loved her parents deeply and still grieved them, but there was acceptance in her grief that Owen envied. Ada learned that Owen had come to Wyoming from Kansas, following the promise of cheap land and new beginnings. That he'd married Sarah when they were both 20, that their marriage had been happy but brief, and that he'd spent the last 4 years trying to figure out how to live with the hole their deaths had left in his life. She didn't push him to talk more than he was ready to, but she listened when he did, and that made all the difference. They finished the eastern fence and moved on to other sections. They cut hay in the long summer evenings, storing it in the barn for winter feed. They repaired the barn roof, patched holes in the water troughs, and dealt with the 100 small crises that made up ranch life. Through it all, they worked as a team, and Owen found himself increasingly aware of Ada in ways that had nothing to do with ranch work. The way her face lit up when she laughed at something, the competent movements of her hands when she was working, the sound of her singing to herself when she thought he wasn't listening, the way she'd started bringing small touches of life back to his house, a jar of wildflowers on the table, curtains she'd sewn from fabric she'd found in town, the smell of bread baking that filled the house with warmth. About 6 weeks after Ada arrived, Owen had to go into chloride for supplies. Ada offered to come along, and he was glad for the company on the 2-hour wagon ride. As they rolled into town, Owen was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Martha Patterson practically ran out of the general store when she saw them pull up. "Owen Rutherford, you've got some nerve not telling me you actually hired that young woman," she said, but there was a twinkle in her eye that suggested she was more pleased than offended. "Mrs. Patterson," Owen said evenly. "I believe you were the one who sent her to me in the first place." "Well, someone had to do something. You were wasting away out there. Now let me get a proper look at you, Miss Reeves." Martha turned her attention to Ada, who'd climbed down from the wagon and was meeting the older woman's scrutiny with calm dignity. "You're looking better than when you came through here. He's been feeding you properly then." "Yes, madam. Mr. Rutherford has been very generous." "I'm sure he has, and it's working out. The arrangement," Ada's smile was genuine. "Very well. We've accomplished more in the last 6 weeks than I think either of us expected." Martha nodded approvingly. "Good, good. Well, come inside and tell me what you need. And Owen, don't think I haven't noticed you look better too, almost like a human being again instead of a ghost." As they gathered their supplies, Owen was aware of more attention from the other people in town. Most of it seemed positive, curious but not hostile, though he did catch a few disapproving looks from some of the more religious townsfolk. He knew what they were thinking: a single man and woman living on the same property without being married, and he felt a flash of defensive anger on Ada's behalf when they were loading the wagon. The local minister, Reverend Harrison, approached them. He was a young man, earnest and well-meaning, and Owen braced himself for a lecture. "Mr. Rutherford, Miss Reeves," the Reverend said, tipping his hat, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but there's been some talk in town about your living situation." "I mind," Owen said flatly. The Reverend looked startled but pressed on. "I'm sure everything is perfectly proper, but appearances matter, especially for a young woman's reputation. I wonder if perhaps Miss Reeves might not be better served by staying with one of the families in town." Before Owen could respond, Ada stepped forward. "Reverend Harrison, I appreciate your concern, but my reputation is my own business. Mr. Rutherford has treated me with nothing but respect, and I'm doing honest work for honest compensation. If some people choose to think poorly of that, that reflects on them, not on us." The Reverend opened his mouth, closed it, and then nodded slowly. "I suppose you're right, Miss Reeves. I apologize if I've given offense. I only wanted to help." "Then help by telling people to mind their own business," Ada said, but her tone was gentle enough to take the sting out of it. As they drove back to the ranch, Owen found himself grinning. "You handled that well." "Did I? I probably just made things worse." "No, you were perfect. Standing up for yourself like that." Owen paused, then added more quietly, "Thank you for defending me too, defending us." Ada turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression that made Owen's breath catch. "There's nothing to defend. What we have here, it's good and honest work. It's friendship. It's respect. Anyone who can't see that isn't worth worrying about. Friendship." The word should have been reassuring, confirmation that they were on the same page about their relationship. Instead, Owen found himself disappointed, wanting to argue that what was growing between them was more than friendship, even if he wasn't quite ready to name it yet. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a charged silence, full of things neither of them was saying. Summer turned toward fall, and with the change in seasons came a shift in the dynamic between them. The work continued, preparing the ranch for winter, but there were more moments when Owen would catch Ada looking at him, or he'd realize he'd been staring at her, and the air would feel thick with possibility. One evening in late September, they were sitting on Owen's porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Ada had brought her coffee outside, and she sat in the chair next to his, her feet tucked up under her, and a blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the cooling air. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. "My month trial was 6 weeks ago. We never talked about whether the arrangement was working out." Owen's heart sank. He deliberately avoided bringing it up because he didn't want to face the possibility of Ada leaving. "Are you wanting to move on?" "No," Ada said quickly. "No, that's not what I meant. I want to make sure you're satisfied with the arrangement, that I'm pulling my weight." "Ada, You've transformed this ranch in 3 months. I couldn't have done half of what we've accomplished on my own. If anyone should be worried about the arrangement working out, it's you. I'm probably not paying you enough. You're giving me a home, Ada said softly. That's worth more than money. Something in her voice made Owen turn to look at her properly. In the fading light, her face was soft and open, vulnerable in a way he'd rarely seen. Is this home for you? Really? Ada met his eyes, and Owen saw the truth there before she spoke it. It's becoming home. This ranch, this work, this life. She paused, then added even more quietly, you. The air between them felt electric, charged with 3 months of growing feelings that neither had been willing to acknowledge. Owen knew he should be careful, should think about all the reasons why acting on what he was feeling was complicated. But sitting there in the twilight with Ada looking at him like he was something precious, all those reasons felt very far away. Ada, he said, his voice rough, I need you to know something. When you first showed up at my gate, I thought I was doing you a favor, giving you a place to stay and work to do. But the truth is, you saved me. I was drowning out here in grief and loneliness and just going through the motions of living. You made me want to live again. Ada's eyes were shining with unshed tears. Owen, I know it's complicated, he continued. I know people will talk, and I know I'm probably not ready for this, and I know you deserve better than a broken-down rancher who's still figuring out how to be whole again. But I need you to know that what I feel for you, it's not just gratitude or friendship or convenience. It's more. A lot more. What are you saying? Ada whispered. Owen reached out and took her hand, marveling at how right it felt when her fingers intertwined with his. I'm saying I'm falling in love with you. Maybe I've been falling since that first day when you stood at my gate and said you'd heard I needed help. You were right. I did need help. I needed you. A tear spilled down Ada's cheek, but she was smiling. I fell in love with you somewhere between mending that first fence and learning how you take your coffee. I kept telling myself it was just gratitude, just relief at having a safe place to land. But it's so much more than that. You're so much more than that. Owen stood up, pulling Ada with him, and then he was cupping her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away her tears. Can I kiss you, please? She breathed. The first touch of their lips was gentle, tentative, both of them almost afraid of the intensity of what they were feeling. But then, Ada made a small sound and pressed closer, and Owen's restraint shattered. He kissed her like she was air and he'd been drowning, like she was home and he'd been lost, like she was the future and he'd been stuck in the past. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Owen rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he said. Not as my employee, not as a temporary arrangement. Stay because you want to build a life here with me. Yes, Ada said without hesitation. Yes, I'll stay. I'll stay forever if you'll have me. They stood there on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms as the stars came out, and Owen felt something he'd thought was dead come back to life. Hope, joy, the belief that the future could be something worth looking forward to. Over the next few weeks, their relationship shifted from the hidden thing it had been to something they lived openly. They still worked the ranch during the day, but now there were stolen kisses in the barn, hands held while they walked the fence lines, and evenings spent wrapped together on the porch talking about everything and nothing. Ada moved her few possessions into the main house, and they began building the kind of life together that made the isolation of the ranch feel less like loneliness and more like sanctuary. In late October, Owen took Ada back to Chloride. He'd been thinking about what he wanted to say, how he wanted to do this, and he was nervous in a way he hadn't been since he'd proposed to Sarah a lifetime ago. Martha Patterson saw them come in together, Ada's hand tucked into Owen's elbow, and her face lit up like Christmas morning. Well, I see things have progressed nicely. Mrs. Patterson, Owen said formally, I need to buy a ring. The older woman's eyes went wide, and she let out a whoop that had everyone in the store turning to look. About time. I've been waiting for you two to figure out what was obvious to everyone else. Owen felt his face heat, but Ada was laughing, and the sound made everything worth it. Martha pulled out a small collection of rings she kept for such occasions, and Owen and Ada looked through them together. Most were too ornate or too expensive, but then Ada gasped and picked up a simple gold band with a small emerald set in it. That one's special, Martha said. It belonged to my mother. The emerald came from a mine in Colorado. It's nothing fancy, but it's genuine. It's perfect, Ada breathed, slipping it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her. Owen paid what Martha asked without haggling, and then they walked to the church, hand in hand, to find Reverend Harrison. The young minister looked surprised to see them but smiled warmly. Reverend, Owen said, Ada and I would like to get married, soon if possible. Reverend Harrison's smile widened. I'm very glad to hear it. Have you thought about when? Ada and Owen looked at each other, and Ada spoke the thought they'd both been having. Why wait? We've both lost enough time to grief and wandering. If we can do it today, we'd like to. The Reverend looked thoughtful. There are usually preparations, a proper ceremony. But given your circumstances, and the fact that you're both of age and certain, I don't see why we can't do something simple. We'll need witnesses. Let me get my wife, and perhaps Mrs. Patterson would agree to stand up for you as well. An hour later, Owen and Ada stood in the small church with Martha and the Reverend's wife as witnesses while Reverend Harrison performed a simple ceremony. Ada wore the same dress she'd been wearing when she arrived at Owen's gate, cleaned and pressed, and Owen wore his Sunday best, which was still worn but respectable. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife and told Owen he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared felt like a promise, like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. That night, they drove back to the ranch as the sun set, painting the Wyoming sky in brilliant colors. Ada leaned against Owen's shoulder in the wagon, and he wrapped his arm around her, marveling at how his life had transformed in just a few months. I love you, he said into her hair. I love you too, Ada replied. Thank you for taking a chance on the desperate woman who showed up at your gate. Thank you for being brave enough to show up. Their first winter together was hard, as Wyoming winters always were, but it was also filled with a kind of contentment Owen had forgotten was possible. They worked side by side to keep the cattle fed and healthy, to keep the snow cleared from the pathways, to keep the fires burning and the water from freezing. But in the evenings, they'd retreat to the warmth of their house and each other, and Owen would think about how he'd believed his life was over and how wrong he'd been. Ada brought music back into the house, singing while she cooked and sometimes coaxing Owen to dance with her in the small space of the kitchen. She brought laughter, teasing him when he got too serious and making him see the humor in situations he would have found only frustrating before. And she brought touch, the simple human contact he hadn't realized he'd been starving for, a hand on his shoulder, fingers running through his hair, the warmth of her body curled against his on cold nights. In turn, Owen gave Ada the stability and security she'd been searching for, the sense of having a home that was truly hers and a partner who saw her as an equal. He valued her opinion, sought her input on ranch decisions, and made it clear that they were building their future together, not her joining the life he already had. Spring came, and with it, rain. Real rain, the kind that soaked into the parched earth and brought the grass back green and lush. Owen and Ada stood on the porch watching the first storm roll in, and Ada turned to him with a smile. I told you, she said. Good bones. This land was just waiting. You were right, Owen agreed, pulling her close, about the land and about everything else. They expanded the herd that year, buying more cattle with the money from Ada's emerald ring, which she'd insisted they sell despite Owen's protests. It's our future, she'd said, and that's worth more than any ring. But Owen had quietly commissioned a replacement from a jeweler in Cheyenne, using money he'd saved from their first successful cattle sale. When he gave it to her on their first anniversary, Ada had cried and called him ridiculous and wonderful in the same breath. 2 years after Ada had arrived at Owen's gate, she came to him one evening with news that made his heart feel like it might burst. "We're going to have a baby," she said, her hands pressed to her still flat stomach. Owen's first reaction was fear, raw and immediate, remembering Sarah and the daughter he'd never gotten to hold. But then he looked at Ada's face, radiant with joy and hope, and he forced himself to breathe through the panic. "Are you scared?" Ada asked gently. She knew his history, knew what he'd lost. "Terrified," he admitted, "but I'm happy too, so happy I don't have words for it." Ada took his hands and placed them on her stomach. "We're going to be fine, all 3 of us, I feel it." And somehow Owen believed her. They prepared through the summer and fall, fixing up one of the spare rooms as a nursery, accumulating baby clothes and supplies with help from Martha and other women in town who were genuinely happy for them. Owen hovered, more protective than he'd ever been, and Ada tolerated it with grace and occasional exasperation. "I'm not fragile," she reminded him when he tried to stop her from helping with the lighter ranch work. "I know. I just can't lose you," he said simply, and Ada's expression softened. "You won't. We're stronger together, remember," in February, on a night when the snow was falling soft and steady outside, Ada went into labor. Owen had brought a doctor from Chloride to stay with them for the last week, and the man proved his worth as the labor progressed. It was long and hard, and there were moments when Owen's fear threatened to overwhelm him. But Ada was strong, stronger than he'd ever imagined, and when the sun rose over the snow-covered ranch, the sound of a baby's cry filled the house. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, placing the squalling infant in Ada's arms. Owen looked down at his wife and son, both alive and healthy, and felt tears streaming down his face. "He's perfect. You're perfect." "What should we name him?" Ada asked, exhausted but beaming. Owen thought about it, about new beginnings and second chances and the woman who'd appeared at his gate and changed everything. "What about Samuel? It means God has heard." "Samuel Rutherford," Ada tested the name. "It's perfect." Samuel grew into a curious, energetic child who loved the ranch as much as his parents did. 2 years later, Ada gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, because, as Owen said, Grace was what had brought them together, and Grace was what sustained them. And 3 years after that, another son they named Daniel, completing their family. The ranch thrived under Owen and Ada's partnership, becoming one of the most successful in the region. They expanded carefully, never growing beyond what they could manage, and built a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. Ada's instincts about the land having good bones proved prophetic. The rains had returned, and the grass grew thick and abundant. As their children grew, Owen and Ada made sure to teach them everything they knew about the ranch, about hard work and partnership, and treating the land with respect. Samuel turned out to have his father's quiet strength and his mother's determination. Grace had Owen's thoughtfulness and Ada's fearlessness. And Daniel was pure joy, finding delight in everything from mucking stalls to watching cattle graze. Owen never forgot the darkness he'd lived through after losing Sarah, and he never took for granted the life he'd built with Ada. On their 10th anniversary, they stood on the same porch where he'd first kissed her, watching their children play in the yard, and Ada turned to him with a smile. "You ever think about that day I showed up at your gate?" "All the time," Owen admitted. "I think about how close I came to sending you away, and it terrifies me. I'd almost given up on everything. On hope, on the ranch, on life. And then there you were." "I heard you needed help," Ada quoted, laughing at the memory. "Best rumor Martha Patterson ever spread," Owen said, pulling Ada close. "You did help me. You saved me. You gave me a reason to live again, to hope again, to love again." "We saved each other," Ada corrected. "I was just as lost as you were. I just hid it better. But finding you, building this life with you, it's everything I never knew I was looking for." They kissed there on the porch, two people who'd found each other when they both needed it most, who'd built something beautiful out of loneliness and courage and a willingness to take a chance. The years continued to pass, bringing challenges and triumphs, sorrows and joys. They lost cattle to harsh winters and celebrated abundant springs. They saw their children grow into capable adults who chose to stay and work the ranch alongside them, bringing their own spouses and eventually children to the homestead. They watched Chloride grow from a small frontier town into a more established community, and they remained active parts of it, respected and loved. Owen's hair turned gray, and lines appeared around Ada's eyes, but they aged together, their love deepening with each passing year. On cold nights, they'd sit together by the fire, Owen reading while Ada worked on some mending or knitting, comfortable in the kind of companionable silence that only comes from decades of partnership. "You have any regrets?" Ada asked him one evening when they were well into their 60s, the ranch now mostly managed by Samuel and his wife. Owen thought about it seriously, because Ada deserved a real answer. "I regret the years I wasted after Sarah died, drowning in grief instead of living. But I can't completely regret them because they led me to you." "What about you?" "No regrets," Ada said firmly. "Every hard thing I went through, every loss, every struggle, it all brought me to that moment at your gate, and everything since then has been better than I ever dreamed possible. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, because we faced them together." As they grew older, they made sure their children and grandchildren knew the story of how they met, the lonely cowboy and the desperate woman who'd heard he needed help. They wanted them to understand that love could come when you least expected it, that taking chances mattered, and that sometimes the best things in life started with someone being brave enough to show up at a gate and offer help. Owen lived to be 78 years old, long enough to see his great-grandchildren running through the same fields where he'd once worked alone and lost. When he died peacefully in his sleep, Ada at his side, he went with a sense of completion, knowing he'd been given a second chance at happiness and had made the most of it. Ada lived 3 more years, spending them surrounded by the family she and Owen had created, still sharp and engaged until the very end. On her last day, sitting on the porch that had witnessed so many important moments in her life, her children and grandchildren gathered around her. "What's the secret?" her granddaughter asked. "To a life well lived," Ada smiled, thinking about the scared woman she'd been and the full life she'd found. "Show up," she said. "Even when you're afraid, even when you're uncertain, show up. Help when you can, accept help when you need it. And love with everything you have." That night, Ada passed away peacefully, joining Owen in whatever came next. Their children buried them on a small hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple stone that read, "Owen and Ada Rutherford, who found each other when both were lost, and built a life of love and purpose together." The ranch continued for generations, passing from Samuel to his children and then to theirs, each generation adding their own stories to the land while remembering the foundation, Owen and Ada had laid. The story of how they met became family legend, told and retold, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from a moment of courage, a willingness to be vulnerable, and the belief that help can arrive exactly when you need it most. The old gate where Ada had stood that first day was eventually replaced, but the new one bore a small plaque that read, "I heard you needed help, Ada to Owen, 1878. It stood as a monument not just to their love story, but to the power of showing up, of taking chances, of believing that even in our loneliest moments, connection and hope are possible. And on quiet evenings, when the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass that grew thick and green over the land Ada had called Good Bones, you could almost hear the echoes of their story, a cowboy and a woman at a gate, finding in each other exactly what they both needed, home and partnership, and a love that lasted beyond their lifetimes, woven into the very fabric of the land they'd tended together. The town of Chloride continued to grow and change over the decades, but Martha Patterson's general store remained a fixture until her own passing at 92. She never tired of telling the story of how she'd sent a desperate young woman to a lonely cowboy's ranch and started what became the most enduring love story the town had ever known. "Sometimes," she'd say with a knowing smile, "people just need a little push in the right direction. And maybe some well-placed gossip." The legacy Owen and Ada left wasn't just in the thriving ranch or the family they'd raised, though those were significant. It was in the example they'd set of what real partnership looked like, how two broken people could come together and build something whole and beautiful. Their story became a touchstone in Chloride, referenced whenever someone spoke of true love or second chances or the importance of community. Years after both were gone, a journalist came through Wyoming collecting frontier stories and heard about the Rutherfords. The article he wrote, published in a Denver newspaper, opened with the line, "In 1878, a woman arrived at a lonely cowboy's gate and said she'd heard he needed help." What followed was a love story that transformed not just two lives, but an entire community's understanding of what partnership and devotion could look like. But perhaps the truest measure of their legacy was simpler and more personal. It was in the way their children spoke of them with reverence and love, the way their grandchildren aspired to find what they'd had, and the way their great-grandchildren grew up believing that real, lasting love was possible, because they'd seen the evidence of it in every corner of the ranch, in every family story, in the very land itself that still thrived under the care of those who'd learned from Owen and Ada's example. On the ranch house mantel, preserved carefully through the generations, sat two items: a worn pair of work gloves that had belonged to Ada and Owen's first branding iron. They stood as reminders that the greatest love stories aren't always about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Sometimes they're about showing up when someone needs help, about working side by side through seasons of drought and plenty, about building something together one fence post and one day at a time, about choosing each other over and over again through all the years of a life. And somewhere in the Wyoming soil, enriched by decades of careful tending, the roots of the trees Owen and Ada had planted together grew deep and strong, sheltering new generations who would tell their story and carry forward the lesson they'd lived. That love, real love, is as much about partnership and respect and daily choice as it is about passion and romance. That sometimes the person who changes everything is the one brave enough to show up at your gate offering help. And that, from the loneliest moments, can grow the most abundant lives if we're willing to open our hearts and take the chance.